All right, welcome to the Daily Fantasy Flex podcast, the PGA edition. This is your host, Bryan Mears. I'm joined as usual by Colin Davey and Peter Jennings, aka Sushi Ram 88. In this section, we are going to spend a couple minutes discussing FanDuel Golf and their new changes to their product, how we think that's going to affect strategy, and just general thoughts moving forward with that product. We will be releasing the regular pod where we discuss the Memorial Tournament and recap last week's tournament as well. You can definitely check that out in the feed. But again, we are talking FanDuel Golf here. Colin, I'll start with you. We've talked about FanDuel Golf quite a bit. If you haven't seen, really the thing that changed is FanDuel had 8 golfers. You had to pick 4 for rounds 1 and 2 and 4 for rounds 3 and 4. So that was the big difference. FanDuel also has a lower salary floor than DraftKings, so player salaries are more spread out, more distributed. But the big difference was that rounds 1 and 2 versus rounds 3 and 4. And the biggest change is that FanDuel has eliminated that structure from their contests. You have to pick 8 golfers for any round. So it's like DraftKings. Instead of picking 6 golfers, you have to pick 8 golfers. So pretty similar to DraftKings now. Colin, I'll start with you. What were your general thoughts on the changes that FanDuel made here?
I think it was a positive change, only in the sense that, pretty much anything would have been positive from the original format. I think we talked a bunch about, how game theory plays out and what decisions are correct in the old format because, the rules are the rules, decisions were great. But I don't think the decisions, I think we called pretty early on the decisions that players would have been making wouldn't necessarily correlate with the outcomes as far as how golfers did versus how they did in DFS contests. I think there was just so much randomness in terms of who goes off in which section of the rounds that it was so much more of a crapshoot than maybe FanDuel realized, and it's not something that players necessarily enjoyed. So I think it's a good change just from a customer experience standpoint. And we'll talk about the strategy standpoint a lot more, but I'd be interested to see how ownership plays out, but I think the strategy is going to be by and large the same thing as DraftKings, and there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. Obviously, the big difference is you have 8 golfers instead of 6. All else being equal, I think the more opportunities that people have to make mistakes in terms of generating the perfect lineup, the more of an edge it'll give to people who know what they're doing. I don't think it'll be as much because there's just so much variance in golf still. But I think it's a positive change. I think for the time being, if I had to do a single cheat sheet version, it's just use your DraftKings strategies. It's going to be by and large the same. Pete, do you agree with that? And do you like the changes?
Love the changes. Agree with you completely. I think the old format was certainly interesting from a game theory standpoint, but overall, it's just a really frustrating format. Cash games, you saw a ton of overlap. I think this new format's just substantially better. And yeah, your goal now is to pick the best 8 golfers. We'll see how pricing ends up as we get further into the season and how they adjust. But it's going to be very similar. And, the key is going to be evaluating value and then also figuring out ownership, which will be a lot more fun. I like the ownership angle of this a lot better than I did trying to peg, okay, these guys are going to be heavily owned in rounds 3 and 4. Let's move them up to the front or, basically trying to do random stuff. And I think this is just a way better format.
Yeah. So let's dive into some strategy real quick. So like I mentioned, the FanDuel does have a much lower salary floor. They go down to about $4,500 in salary versus DraftKings really only gets down to about $6,500. And the ceilings on these are pretty similar. The highest guy this week actually is DJ at $12K, and he's 11.8 on FanDuel. So they're pretty close to each other up at the top. The difference is that these minimum guys go a lot lower. So I'm curious, Colin, you said it's like DraftKings, but I still think that it's a little bit different in that it really, really favors stars and scrubs. You can just get the stars in so much easier. That was the case with rounds 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. But I don't think that really has changed more so than DraftKings, where it's a little bit tighter. If you roster a DJ or a Rory or whoever it may be at 12, almost 13K, it really hurts you to fill out your roster around them. On FanDuel, that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. What are your thoughts on just the gap between the highest guys and the lowest guys?
So I agree. This is kind of almost like a throwback to when DK used to have their salary floor around like 5,500, right? So when you have 4,500 and you can fit in a lot more, keep in mind that like it's maybe like a slightly different metric. Maybe it's about equivalent because, you do have 8 golfers to fit instead of 6. So that's why your salary range is going to be like way wider. So if you want to go stars and scrubs, like you need an even lower floor. So like if you want to do like almost like a floor divided by number of golfers or something like that is probably about right. I agree that the format favors being able to fit in stars and scrubs a lot more. And if I had to guess how it's going to play out the first couple of weeks, I think because it's such a break from DraftKings that people want to, because you can do that a lot more. Whether or not that's game theory optimal or not, like I'm not necessarily sure. I think it's going to be really tough. It's tough enough to get 6 out of 6 through the cut. I mean, it's not like necessarily just 25% harder to get 8 out of 8, like which you essentially have to have if you want to take on a GPP. I'm curious as far as like I'll have to run some numbers to see like, how much more, like if you just like threw darts at a wall or whatever, like how much more difficult is it to get 8 out of 8 versus 6 out of 6? And does that necessarily not favor stars and scrubs? Assuming that you want to crack the top 1% or whatever. So I think I think if I had to guess where there's opportunity, it's actually not going stars and scrubs because that's what everyone else is going to do proportionally.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good analysis there. Pete, what are your thoughts on, I think generally people were looking at DraftKings salary as almost like a proxy, sort of like our bargain rating with other sports where you can look at one site and sort of spot the inefficiencies on the other. You think people are going to do that even more so now just because FanDuel and DraftKings product looks pretty similar? I mean, we have a pretty stark example this week for the Memorial. Last year's winner, William Dirt McGirt, he is 8,600 on DraftKings, but he's only 6,900 on FanDuel. Huge difference. What are your thoughts on sort of the interaction of the two sites as far as ownership goes?
Absolutely. People are definitely going to be considering that. And, it's a great way to get exposure to different players. If you're playing a lot of volume, it's an opportunity to hedge as well. There certainly can be merit to taking guys at a certain price on one side and not taking them on the other. So in that regard, you get a little bit more diversity in your player pool and who you're exposed to in DFS. So I think it's going to be something that's definitely important and certainly something that people will be paying attention to. I think the consensus is that DraftKings pricing sharper than FanDuel's, and we'll see if that continues to be the case. But as of now, just looking through it, I certainly think that's the case this week.
Cool. Last question I have for you guys, Colin. I'll throw this one at you first here. Like take another sport like MLB, for example. DraftKings has 2 pitchers. FanDuel has 1. So what we see is that there's a lot higher ownership on DraftKings for pitchers because you can roster 2 of them. So, on FanDuel, we can only roster 1. It sort of collectively brings down the ownership of every single pitcher. Do you think that there's some sort of dynamic here with just having 8 golfers for 6? Do you think that ownership is going to be largely up on everyone on FanDuel as opposed to DK? Or how do you think that just having 2 extra golfers is really going to affect the ownership of everyone, let alone the top guys?
The ownership per golfer is probably going to be a little bit lower. Like it's basically like how much do people, it's almost like relative to DraftKings, like who drops and all of that. Like what does the curve look like? It's a good question. And the short, I honestly don't know. I think it'll be something that can be probably figured out in the first couple of weeks once we get actual lineups and we can see how people are actually making their decisions. Mm-hmm. Just given the sheer number of, permutations and combinations explodes this way. And yet, I would probably guess, on a relative term, I think people are still going to cluster around the same people, only because ownership is still so driven by people trying to follow expert consensus around here, like more than most people realize, that I think like even in a universe of possibilities, people are going to still cluster at least like at the top range of the ownership on a relative basis. I think people are still all going to pick the same like 5 or 6 guys because ownership is so consensus driven. So I think it actually may be the opposite. Instead of like normal diffusion, you get disproportionate ownership on certain guys relative to, how spread out a quote unquote should be with all the combinations you could make.
Yeah. Any last thoughts on ownership or just the FanDuel product here, Pete? Yeah, like my thought is that with 8 golfers, with 6, DJ is popular, or a guy like DJ or Rahm or Ricky. With 8 golfers, I think a lot of people are going to like, am I really going to roster 8 guys ahead of Dustin Johnson,
Yeah, we'll see how it shakes out. I'm really excited for the change. I think it's going to make the summer that much more fun. The combination of baseball and golf, it's not the greatest time in sports, but I'm really actually starting to enjoy it. So FanDuel changing their product really, I think, is a win for the industry. And, I'll be, playing quite a bit. I think that it'll be more fun for tournaments, making a player pool and just figuring out how to go after it. So I think hopefully we'll see bigger tournaments from FanDuel. And hopefully this is just good for DFS golf. I mean, all of us love it, and really hope it grows. In terms of, your DJ question, I mean, I'm curious to see how people end up building these rosters. Looking through, there's definitely some guys who are very cheap. So probably going to be easier to get someone like DJ. But, we'll see how everything shakes out just in terms of ownership and where people are going. I definitely think there's some pretty good value, but I can see merit to playing some balanced rosters as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, that will end our analysis of FanDuel. Definitely excited to see growth in this regard. And now that, I think that this product is definitely going to grow on the site, we will definitely incorporate analysis of FanDuel and salaries and stuff into our regular podcast moving forward throughout the summer. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for listening. If you want to catch our analysis of the Memorial Tournament this week, check out your feed for that.